Saloni Zimba, who are both work in the British Council in Chennai. And they're going to talk to you today about their experiences of working with hearing impaired students and using the communicative approach, how effective it was in teaching English. At the end there will be time for some questions.
Okay, before we launch into our presentation today, I'd like 9 volunteers to come to the front, please. So that's most of you. So come. One, two, 3, 4, thank you. Can you come, please? 5, 6. Okay, 4, please. 5, it's very easy. Hang on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Can I ask you, madam? Please, 7, and you do come. Yes, that's no problem at all. Come. Sorry? 9. 9, we've got 6, we've got 7, 8, and one more, please. Okay, you all right? And you're going to join in? Okay, so we're going to start with an activity now. And I've got words on a card. And you need to arrange yourselves in a line so that the words make a question. But there's one rule. You can't talk to each other. Okay, you can read out the word, but that's the only thing you can do. You're not allowed to talk to each other, okay? All right, so what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Okay.
We're going to arrange ourselves in such a way that it will be a question sentence.
Yeah. So each one has a word, and you need to make a sentence, a question, okay? And can you talk to each other?
Are we starting from there? The first word? I think that makes sense. Okay.
Okay, let's have a look. So, can we each
Hearing
impaired
students using a communicative approach.
Okay. Okay, well done. Sit down.
Everybody just let them.
Thank you. So there's our question here. Okay. What I'd like you to do is have a look at these questions, and can you just talk to the person next to you for a couple of minutes and talk about these questions, please? So just turn to the person next to you and discuss these questions. Okay. Okay, everyone. Sorry, there's lots of interesting discussions happening, but I'm going to have to stop you there. just out of interest, how many of you, can you raise your hands, how many of you got experience of teaching hearing impaired students? Okay.
My neighbor's daughter has, she's but she's having that problem.
Okay. All right, great, thank you. And anybody else? You've got experience. Okay, great, thank you, thank you. So most of you are in the same situation that Saloni and I were when we first started teaching our class. And one of the reasons that we're here today is to share our experience and to show you that so many things are possible with a hearing impaired class. And also that we're not coming from a position here as experts. We're by no means experts in this field. It was a learning experience for all of us, and hopefully the points that we make today will be useful for you. And hopefully throughout the course of the presentation, we will be able to answer some of these questions. Okay? Okay, so we've split the presentation into 3 sections. We'll tell you how we prepared to teach the class. We'll look at the teaching, we'll look at some of the challenges that we faced, and also we're going to give you an opportunity to try some of the activities that we adapted. And then we're going to just review the lessons that we learned. And hopefully this year we're going to be teaching another hearing impaired class at the same place, so obviously they feed back in to our teaching of that class. Okay, let me just give you an overview of the project. We were approached by Scope, who I'm sure you've all heard of. They're part of Standard Chartered Bank and one of our corporate clients at the British Council. And they had a class of 8 employees who were all hearing impaired. So they had been doing a year-long intervention with these students. They'd started off with self-esteem training, they'd gone on to computer skills training, and the final part of the intervention was they wanted some English skills training for their students. So they approached the British Council and said, will you be able to help? And of course, we said yes. So the BC teachers were asked to lead the project, to come up with the syllabus, to come up with the aims of the course. So the first thing that we wanted to do was to meet with the students and do a diagnostic. Now we have a written level test, but also because there was nobody in the council who had experience, I wanted to go and see what it was like to teach a class. So it was really important for me to go to Scope and meet the students and have a demo class with them, because it gave me an idea of what was possible in the classroom. So me and an interpreter, we had a demo class, and also spoke to the students about how they like to learn. And something that's really important is to remember that all students are individual, all students have their own learning styles, and so you have to take each class and each student as an individual. So it was a really fruitful meeting, and I learned lots about classroom practice and what would work. Okay? So moving into more preparation. Okay, so after the demo lesson and some written samples that we could analyse, we realised that they were of an elementary level, sort of ranging from fairly low to fairly high elementary. And our aim was to come up with a business writing skills course, so quite a challenge anyway. We met with the Ability Foundation. Now, how many of you have heard of the Ability Foundation? Excellent. The Ability Foundation are a Chennai-based organisation who work with differently abled people and who've been completely invaluable in our experience. And so they met with us to give us as much advice as possible about working with hearing impaired people. We also organised some sign language lessons, so we thought it was really important that we could also communicate. Obviously the students could lip read, but we thought sign language would help. So we made a list of all the classroom language that we use commonly, like work in pairs, work in groups, read and answer the questions, and all of those things. And we learned some sign language for the classroom language, so we wouldn't always be reliant on the interpreter. We met with the interpreter as well,
And one thing that we found was really important, and what ability advised us to do, was to work through some guidelines with the interpreter. So I'll just give you an idea now of the kind of guidelines that are useful to go through with the interpreter. Okay.
Could you read that out aloud because we've got some...
Yeah, that's fine, okay. Alright, so interpreters should not give their opinion of a student's progress. Very important that the interpreter is a facilitator in the class, not an extra teacher. You need to give outlines of the lesson before you teach it, so the interpreter's prepared, so that they can think about what they're going to explain and instruct. One really great thing was spending parts of the lesson interpreter-free. So really important so that the students aren't reliant on the interpreter all the time, because you lose that connection between the teacher and the class. And actually it made the students work harder to try and understand us. So that kind of mirrored what was happening in their real life at work when they're talking to people who don't sign. So it was a good point for us, and some lessons we had the entire lesson interpreter free, and it's not something to be afraid of. So as a teacher, don't be reliant on the interpreter as well. Speak directly to the student, so don't turn to the interpreter so the interpreter can talk to the student, because again you're losing that connection between you and the student. The interpreter should use the same word order, so our students were using Indian Sign Language, and the word order is different, okay? So one thing, to provide a good model of the language, we asked the interpreter to use the same word order. Even if it wasn't so natural in sign language, it helped to reinforce some of the grammar that we wanted to teach. The interpreter should only interpret questions, not answer them. So again, it's this thing, you know, the interpreter is your facilitator, not a part of the lesson. And also, if students ask the interpreter questions, the interpreter needs to talk to you. So you really need to make a deal with the interpreter that they're not going to answer for you, because you need to know what's happening in the classroom as the teacher. The interpreter must check for understanding, of course, and the interpreter should stand close to the section of the board being used. So it's always good to stand side by side with the interpreter, so you're all in the same eye line, and also near the board that you're talking about. Okay? Okay, so part of our preparation was to have a look at our elementary general English and business English textbooks, because we needed a syllabus to base our course on. Saloni will tell you later on what some of the challenges were of that. And we needed to look at our methodology. So we're used to a communicative approach in the classroom. We're used to lots of listening and speaking, as well as reading and writing. So we had to have a look at our approach. Now, as I mentioned, our methodology is a communicative approach. And we often think of the communicative approach in terms of speaking and listening, but that's not entirely true, because obviously communicating through writing is also very important. So let's have a look at what Noonan lists as main features of communicative language teaching. An emphasis on learning to communicate through interaction. Well, can we do that in our classroom? Yes, we can. It's just not spoken interaction. The introduction of authentic text into the learning situation. Well, our students wanted business English, so perfect scope there for authentic materials. The provision of opportunities for learners to focus on not only language, but also on the learning process itself. So something we'll talk about is also helping the students to become more autonomous learners. An enhancement of the learner's own personal experience. Again, this goes back to the authentic materials, the business situation. and an attempt to link classroom language learning with language activities outside the classroom. So trying to bring in real life situations. So this is the communicative approach, and we thought, well, we don't see any problem with that. We can use this within our hearing impaired classroom as well. Okay, so we move on to the teaching now. Pass you on to Saloni.
Okay, so Beth actually already introduced the first part, and now on to the teaching. So before we actually go into the classroom per se, there are a few tips that we found useful to look into. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
I think better to keep the mic a bit closer.
All right, I will do that. Okay, so, all right. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so the first aspect that we needed in classroom was body language. Now, given that our learners were, hearing impaired, body language, they were very sensitive to visual clues. And visual clues made up for tone, they made up, for modulation, and they helped keep their attention on the teachers, first of all. Okay. Also, what we found about classroom language was we laminated some fixed expressions like these, and whenever they had a question, they just pick up the right one and show it to us. This helps us in terms of time, because first of all, they didn't have to think about it, they didn't have to write it, and this allowed us, it allowed them kind of to ask questions more spontaneously and more freely. It also helped expose them to the right models, okay, and this was something they could use in everyday life. All right. In terms of laminates, these are some scribble pads that we came up with, and what we did was this allowed them to ask questions, to write answers. Now, this is just scribbling here that you see, okay? But this gave them the freedom to kind of communicate in class, and also gave them a lot of written practice in terms of fluency as well. And just a couple of more hints. Okay, these are some general guidelines. Okay, obviously, you need to be very visible in a hearing impaired class, and you also always start with the concrete example first, and then move on to more abstract. The most important one from here is about giving notes. Okay, it is impossible for hearing impaired students to actually make notes as well as look at you at the same time. So it is imperative that we actually gave them the notes before or after the class. Just a few more about written guidelines here. The most important thing being that everything you give them needs to be very simple and not very clustered or complex, so that hearing impaired students are able to understand it a lot easier and right away. So we've spoken about the different approaches in the communicative approach, and these are the techniques that we use in our classroom to bring it down to our students. Pair and group work. Now this made all the difference between a teaching-centered class, or a teacher-centered class rather, and a student-centered class. So, working in groups, working in pairs allowed our students to kind of negotiate and cooperate with each other, and hence learn from each other. So, and this kind of shifted the focus from a teacher to learn autonomy, where they were learning of each other, and they were learning from from each other, and they were learning for themselves as well. So learn autonomy is something which is very important in our classrooms. And the next focus here, which is noticing and discovering, was perfect for this. A lot of the times, we're taught by the teacher. So on the other hand, discovering allowed them to actually find out things for themselves, to realize the patterns in language. And this was a very important skill that they actually can take outside the classroom and use for everyday learning. So it helped them become independent learners even outside the classroom. Role-playing, actually, this is something very, when we think of role-playing, we think of speaking directly, right? But here in our classroom, what we did was we asked the students to take the role of maybe the manager, maybe a client. So this, or maybe even friends, So it could be in the form of letter writing to each other or dialogue writing. It allowed them to kind of to practice the different functions in language, to practice different registers. So that was really helpful. In terms of fluency and grammar, of course, what we needed in terms of fluency again was not speaking, but the ability to write emails, the ability to write without having to put too much thought to the spontaneity of writing was what we are looking at. Grammar and games, of course, is something that we do in most of our classes, and they were really important. Moving on to the challenges. One of the first challenges that our students come across actually is the fact that they're not just exposed enough to English. Right? As somebody living in India, you cannot escape English. You're inundated with messages in English on the radio, on TV. But unfortunately, our learners do not have access to this. Okay? And not just that, but even in the classroom, they don't have access to even incidental language from the teacher. So this kind of was a very important point. Exposure meant one thing, that because they were not familiar with everything with English, they took a lot longer to become familiar and to learn the same things that a regular learner would learn in a shorter amount of time. Exposure again, listening models, or rather the fact that they didn't actually have access to listening models was another surprising fact, in the sense, when we used textbooks, we discovered that first, there were very few textbooks at the elementary level that dealt with business English. Okay. And on top of that, most of these textbooks use audio text to introduce new points with an audio text. I'm sorry, they use an audio text to introduce new lessons and new points, which meant that we needed to adapt or grade or even develop our own material. So, well, we've already spoken about the fact that our learners were elementary level learners, and given that they were elementary learners, we faced a fair share of problems with grammar, with vocab and comprehension. Okay. What we need to remember here is that other features of sign language. Beth already mentioned how the Indian Sign Language follows a different word order, okay? And sign language is a very spatial language, and that's the way they actually arrange their content words. And in English, we have articles, we have so they made a lot of mistakes rather with omitting articles, with mixing up prepositions, word order, and vocab as well. Another point that we need to remember here is that, in sign language, with our learners, vocab wasn't so much of a problem because they were being exposed to English quite a bit at work. In sign language, vocab is a very conceptual language. So what happens is, instead of 3 different words for maybe cool, cold, and freezing, they just have one expression, and then that modulates with the rest of the body language. So, yes, and a very important point here was thinking, and critical thinking skills. We mentioned earlier the importance of noticing and discovering for yourself. What we realized was, while our students were able to, manipulate a text to a great extent, they were not able to transfer this to another context. For example, I think this was a midterm assessment. We'd given them a reading comprehension passage in the form of an email, and they were actually supposed to, a few tasks later on, they were supposed to come up with an email. And though they were able to use the format, they weren't able to actually change the little things to make it more appropriate for the task. Okay. One of the biggest thing about about teaching hearing impaired was the timing. Like we said, exposure was very important. So all of this, also the fact that, because they didn't have exposure, they needed a lot more time to familiarize themselves with the content. Another thing is that, when we speak, we use a lot less time as compared to when we communicate by writing all the time. This meant that, a normal classroom took a lot longer for the same activities as compared to when we're actually speaking. Okay? And also, because they already had so little exposure, okay, they needed that extra time to just get familiar and to learn the same things that a regular learner would perhaps learn in a shorter duration. And here we're going to now demonstrate a few activities that actually helped us overcome these challenges. Sorry. Okay, remember the activity we did at the start of the presentation, where I asked you to arrange yourselves? Okay, we'll talk about that first, because that's an activity that we used with our learners that they really enjoyed. When you were doing the activity, how did you communicate?
Through cards.
Through cards. Well, you weren't using the cards to communicate, you were using the cards for the language.
Each card had a word.
It did, absolutely. But when you were arranging yourselves, I told you weren't allowed to talk. You read? Use logic. Okay, how did you move each other? Okay, so you used body language, right? And actually, some of you really wanted to talk for that activity. I noticed you were desperate. So I think this just gives you an experience of what it's like when you're trying to sort of communicate through body language, through gesture. And it's actually a really effective activity that we did quite a lot. And why, well, did the students enjoy it? Well, obviously it's nice, fun activity. But it's focusing very strongly on form and accuracy. And as Saloni mentioned, in sign language, a lot of the non-content words are lost because they're not used in sign language. So this really helps the learners to focus on grammatical accuracy. It's kinesthetic. So it's great for your kinesthetic learners. It's good fun. It gets them out of their seats. It involves peer correction, because we didn't help you. You helped each other. So you were working together and you were correcting yourself, correcting your peers. And we used that either as an introduction to a language point, so like a test, teach, test, or we would do it as a review of form, a practice activity. Okay, so we'll move on to the next activity, which is the Saloni. Thank you. Right. We'll have to work in pairs or group work for this. Okay? So, all right. Can the four of you work together? All right. The four, okay. This group and another one here and together. The other word, and first question
sentence. It's one sentence at a time.
And you get 10 points.
You can have one gap or two gaps, depending on the sentence. Are we ready?
Yes.
Okay. We're done. All right. Okay, great. Next one. Challenging. Okay.
Actually, did you shout out?
Yes.
We showed it.
I should have penalized you.
No, we did not shout out.
We showed it.
Okay, so remember our students need to do everything with reading and writing.
All right, I will read.
Actually, can I also, well, because our learners are looking at visual learners, we're trying to explain what it's like for hearing impaired learners. So would it be okay if we didn't read it out, or would you like someone to sit with you and read it out?
Can you be hearing? Next one. All right. Beth points at team 2.
Oh, points for team 2. Okay.
Okay, team 3. Everybody.
I'll go also. No, you're actually
The next one.
What team number? 4. Team 4.
Team 4. I saw team 7 as well. Team 7.
Okay, again, team 4.
Oh, I think it was a tie, really. Now, what team number are you? 3. 3 and 4. 4.
And also 6.
What team number are you? Who was that?
2.
2. Oh, team 2 are you were
So,
there.
next.
It is appropriate. One month.
Okay, excellent. Well done. So this is applause. So I think all of you deserve some applause. Okay, and team 2.
And team 2 are the winners. So everybody. This is a typical activity we did in class.
This was a typical activity we do in class, and this again, the focus was on form and accuracy. Okay, this usually when we teach new words in our class, we have lots of CCQs or concept check questions, and they're always questions you ask, all right? But this was another way of doing it in a more visual manner. Okay. So. Also, here, because you're working in a pair or working in a group, there's a lot of pair work, and there was a lot of learning from each other. You're correcting yourself and writing the right answers. And the questions that we had, or the gaps that we had, provided very good models and exposed our students to the use of the words even more. In this activity, we use this in class as a review of what we had already learned, but you could also use it as a warm-up in the sense you introduce something after this in terms of maybe, a comparative, okay, between any of the sentences that we learned, that we were actually introduced to. Let's move on to another activity now, okay. This is again a group and pair, group activity, so stick to your groups, okay. This time though, no writing, okay, so you can keep your paper. Yeah, we don't need a pen, you don't need the paper. Yes, okay. This is an activity we did for syllable counting. Okay. Normally, syllable counting is a spoken thing. And this was just another way, just a way that we actually introduced it to our classroom. We had already taught them a few rules about syllables before we did this game, okay, what you need to remember. And your instructions are, right, 10 points for the first team to show me the correct answer. And how are you going to show me the correct answer? Yes. 2 or 4, accordingly. Okay. It starts really easy and then begins to get more difficult. Okay? Alright? So, shall we start?
Yes.
Okay. What will you do when you see the word? Okay, great. Alright. Okay. To make it a little easier to score points, can you stand? The first person who stands can give the answer. Okay? Bingo. Standing, yeah?
Stand by, I don't have to break that.
But you need to show us the number.
Yes.
So you
Okay.
need to show us, so stand and show us 1 or 2.
So, ready?
Ready.
Oh.
What team number are you? Team 3. Oh gosh. I'm not keeping score. Alright. Everybody's a winner.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Oh, Team 7 this time. Now it gets a little more difficult. Okay, easy. Two. One. All right. Two. Great. 3 is the one. All right. 4. Oh, I give you the answer. Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't keep score. So good. That's so sweet.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, good.
Everybody, well done. Right. This was the next part of this activity. Okay. And each of you actually gets a worksheet. And this actually leads on to a guided discovery, where you look at this, and these are all words that we've just practiced, and fill up the form.
You can do it with the group, or you can do it individually. There you go. Use this to complete this.
All right, thank you. Let's check your answers. Again, this activity focused on form. What we need to remember here is that when we use these words, okay, as an instructor, the teacher, we need to also enunciate it clearly so that we give an opportunity for our learners to familiarize themselves with the way it's actually said. Okay? Because a lot of times they have to actually read it off a person. Right. This activity here, the guided discovery, allows them to work on, on noticing the elements of language for themselves, the patterns of making comparatives. And we did talk about earlier in our challenges, we spoke about how how important it was to notice to become more independent learners. And we also spoke about critical thinking skills, which our learners lacked. So it helped quite a lot in training our learners to learn for themselves. Here, this was, first there was an element of language review because we were practicing words that we had already learned. And as well as the fact that we use this to introduce the comparative. Okay? And obviously you can use this activity in many other ways. Though we use this for circle counting, we could actually use it for grammar to show the past tenses and the present tenses and many other actual ways.
Okay, so
that was some language practice activities. Now we'll move on to our skills, or a demonstration of some of our skills practice activities. Okay. Okay, I'm going to show you the following slide for 30 seconds. And I want you to look very carefully at it. You are not allowed to write anything or say anything, just look, okay? How long have you got to look at the slide? 30 seconds. Are you going to write anything down? No. Okay? What are those, Sal?
okay.
Okay? So ignore that piece of paper, put the piece of paper down, put the paper down. Don't look at it. Look only at the slide. Right. Okay, so you had a good look? Yes. Read it carefully. Now I would like you on the paper and on the lines. You can see you've got an email format here. Can you write the email? Don't worry if you can't remember it perfectly, but try your best on your own to write the email. Can I just borrow that? Okay, so on this side of the paper, what are you going to do?
Write the email.
What happens if you don't remember it perfectly?
Yes.
Doesn't matter, no problem. Just do your best. I'm afraid I'm only going to give you 30 seconds more. We're running out of time. Okay, put your pens down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, don't worry if you haven't finished. In real life we'd give you more time, but we're pressed for time because we started late. Okay, now, I'd like you to swap your email with a partner and, sorry, can I borrow this? If you open the paper here, we've got some check boxes, okay? Okay, so read your partner's emails and complete the check boxes, please. So, has everybody swapped papers? Swap papers? Swap.
Okay. Oh dear. Well, we can say yes for some. We've got dear sir, they've got subject line. That's right. Okay, sorry again to rush you, but now what we would do is we would swap papers back again and you can see how your paper's been reviewed and if you've forgotten anything important from the email. Okay, so there's more activities that we would do post this. We would go back and have a look at the original email and we'd notice any differences between the student's email and the original email, and we'd look to see, well, does it mean the same thing? Does it mean something different? Is there any grammar that you've missed? And this is a kind of dictogloss. Have you heard of dictogloss? Yes? If you haven't, I really strongly advise you to go and look up dictogloss. It's something we usually do orally, but it's also something that you can do visually too. So the beauty of this is that when you were writing the email, it was all about fluency. You were trying to get your email finished, you were trying to communicate, and you weren't thinking as much about accuracy. So that's a nice thing that we wanted to encourage in the class. You're focusing on meaning over form. So if you can express the same meaning in the email, it doesn't matter what form you use, and that's an important thing for the learners to understand, as it's the message that's the most important. And learners have the opportunity to use their existing language resource. They get the opportunity to work with peers and do peer corrections, so that's great for practicing editing skills. And also it helps them notice any gaps in their knowledge and reinforce. So we had aspects of how to formulate an email, about format, style, as well as about the language used. Okay, very quickly, we'll move on to our last skills activity.
All of you now, you're going to get some pictures. You're working in groups again.
And not my favorite thing. Alright, each group you'll get a set of pictures. Your first task is to identify the first and the last picture. Okay? So do you have to arrange the entire pictures in order? No. What do you have to do? First and the last.
Can I explain this? It's somebody's day. So the pictures represent somebody's day in his life. So decide which is the first activity and which is the last. Really sorry, this one. Okay. Would you guys like to work together? You two come and work together. And you work together.
Or, okay, let's check the answers. Alright. Oh, see, there's a trick one there. Okay, right. Right, thank you. Let's move on. We are a little pressed of time. Right, now, you're going to see a passage. Okay, a passage about these pictures. I'd like you to read the passage quickly and to arrange the pictures in the right order. Okay? Alright, and let's start now. Thank you. And shall we move on? Okay. Let's have a look at the answers. Okay, so it's E, I, A, F, B, C, D, H, and G.
Exactly right.
Okay. All right, well done. Okay.
But from the back.
Okay, we follow this up, okay, with maybe allowing you or the students to write, a story to represent the pictures in their own words. Okay. So, and this was a lesson in reading, okay? And it allowed them to practice for gist as well as to predict. Okay? It allowed them to practice reading comprehension. And it gave them an opportunity to work with pairs, like you work with each other to arrange the pictures in the right order. And also because it was actually a lesson about the past or yesterday. So here we are also looking into a few points on language like grammar. Okay. And of course the way it also proved a good exposure to language that we usually use.
Right, how do I get back to Okay, so we hope you enjoyed some of the activities that we did and saw how we just made some changes to very regular classroom activities, but made it all things that could be done by people who can't use listening or speaking activities. I thought you'd like to see our class. This is, we finished teaching them last summer, and this is the graduation ceremony, so the bigwigs from Scope were invited. These are some of our lovely students, and you can see that's Vijaya, our wonderful interpreter. So I thought you'd like to see what our class looked like and how happy they all were and how much they enjoyed their course. Okay, so very briefly, we're going to summarise the lessons learned. So we've made a handout for you to summarise some of the points from here.
Thank you. Right, so since we've already made a handout, this is just to kind of, quickly go through it. So what are the similarities between a regular class and a class with hearing impaired students? And to be honest, not very much, okay? Obviously, they both had problems with grammar, they had problems with vocab and comprehension, but then again, they were all in the elementary level. So, and the right activities can actually always help us overcome those, okay? And of course, all of them just generally enjoy the games and the activities, so that's a very important point that we need to remember. What are the challenges of teaching a hearing impaired class? We've talked about it already, okay? And I think the major ones here are timing, okay? Timing, but if you actually have a look at it, nothing that can't be overcome by just planning ahead or thinking about the lessons a bit creatively. Because if you saw most of our activities, they were just everyday activities that we'd taken and just adapted them to fit our class here. So the final question now is, can the sound barrier be broken? And I'd say absolutely.
Yes. And I think I'd just like to add one more point that, if you haven't taught hearing impaired students, it's not something to be frightened of. It's just like teaching a class of hearing students, only you just have to, as Saloni said, put the planning in. So thank you very much. We've left our email addresses there if you wanted to talk to us, if you wanted to get the link for the Prezi. The Prezi will be available online, so we'll be able to send you the link after this.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Beth and Saloni. Very engaging and interesting presentation. So now I'd like to open up the floor. We don't have a huge amount of time, but we do have a few minutes. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask.
Yes, can I ask the question, please?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Till now, we have seen how we can teach the deaf persons who have sight. But did you design any strategies for the blind deaf people? And my second question is, does the installation of any hearing aid can it improve any perception of the sound in the class? Those are the two questions.
Okay, they're two very good questions. Now, as I said, we're not experts in teaching
in different environments. This was just our experience of teaching a hearing impaired class. And were we to be approached to teach a class with different needs, then we would also do the same thing. We would do our research, we'd do our planning, and we'd learn. But at the moment, we don't have that kind of experience. And in the class, none of our students had hearing aids, did they? They lip read. So a lot of our students were very good lip readers, and of course we had our interpreter. So there was no hearing aids in the class. Okay, thank you. Yeah, the interpreter is a qualified sign language interpreter. So she was provided from the Ability Foundation. Okay?
My question is, can it be done without an interpreter?
As I said, one of the things that we did do was that we had some sections of lessons and some entire lessons without the interpreter. There are advantages to that because the communication is direct, but there are also disadvantages because sometimes maybe some of the more complex explanations were missed. We had to make sure we had a lot more text on the board to explain things. So I think it's great to have an interpreter, at least for part of the time, if you can.
All right, hi. My question is, I am logging.
You've got a great projection.
Thank you. My question is, we just talk about including grammar and we spoke about vocabulary. But when we started the session, did we immediately start with grammar and vocab, or did you have something else as a building block?
When we started the course, or when
Yes.
we started the course? I think it was the skills altogether, really, because there were a lot of writing skills involved and then reading a lot from on the board. And I think if you're just focusing heavily on grammar and vocabulary, you're not putting the language into context. And in order to be able to communicate effectively, particularly because we were doing a business writing class, there had to be context all the way. So we actually started our first lesson with an email introducing yourself. And so we looked at the email as a whole piece and then broke it down into the language items. So it's important that skills are there, definitely, because it's that whole authentic text.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello. Could this also, some of the activities be used for visually challenged students also?
Well, I think if we sort of looked at it in a different way. So, for example, we had the visual dictogloss. Now you can do, and actually the traditional way of doing a dictogloss is a spoken dictogloss. So I think you can adapt. And as I say, unfortunately, we don't have any experience of teaching visually impaired people. But we would adapt the same thought processes. How can we make this more listening and speaking rather than reading and writing? So it's almost like the other side of the coin, isn't it? And obviously using bigger visuals, we could have used bigger visuals for the arranging activity and that kind of thing. Oh, okay, should we got time for one more or are we done? We're done. If obviously we'll be available outside so we can answer some questions there, but I'm afraid we're being cut off. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay.